Every year, throughout the state of Connecticut, large numbers of reenactors turn out to commemorate a special event of the American Revolution. The march through the Nutmeg State by thousands of French troops on their way to join George Washington and the American forces. Now, this is a story that can be told simply. To put it briefly, an army general named Rochambeau came from overseas to support our cause, with soldiers, ships, supplies, money, all of which were desperately needed by the Americans. He marched through Connecticut with his thousands of soldiers to join up with General Washington, and their two armies defeated the British at Yorktown in Virginia. This effectively won the Revolutionary War and allowed the United States of America to come into existence. To tell the story of Rochambeau in Connecticut, we should direct our attention to another French general, a man who was known to just about everyone in our country. His name was really Gilbert de Motier. We know him as the Marquis de Lafayette. It was Lafayette who managed to convince the King of France to send General Rochambeau with troops and supplies to the Americans. Over a period of 5 years or so of the war, the Continental Congress had never been able to send Washington enough of anything. What George Washington must have felt when he found himself surrounded by thousands of new troops, supplies, cavalry, artillery, ammunition, money, even ships, all placed under his command. The American Revolution was back in business. General Rochambeau was a remarkable man. He placed himself and his soldiers subordinate to George Washington, and he ordered that the French troops were to be regarded as auxiliaries to the American forces. And later, the thousands of soldiers began the long march south, 600 miles through 9 states, quite a hike, to walk from Newport, Rhode Island, to Yorktown, Virginia, through the long hot summer. In Connecticut today, in towns from the northeast corner to Ridgefield in the southwest, large numbers of reenactors turn out to commemorate Rochambeau's journey through the state. In the Ridgefield area, they camped east of the Ridgebury Church. Local calendars are today crowded with costume balls, encampments, art exhibitions, historical lectures, all to remember the days when thousands of French soldiers hiked through this state on their way to Yorktown. You could visit the place. It was on this field, indicated by this marker. The reenactment in Ridgefield is one of the best. The French in their white uniforms are well represented among the reenactors, along with their regimental flag. Most of the reenactors take it pretty seriously. They know something now that was not known back in 1781. That march south was not just to a battle. The long hike of these soldiers through Connecticut was to ultimately mean the end of the war, the end of the long, desperate years of the American Revolution. Yes, Rochambeau's trip south was serious business. Many of the French soldiers were to die during the Yorktown battle. But there's a fascinating aspect to the march through the Nutmeg State that you don't read much about in the history books. It had a kind of festive air. In some ways, it was almost a picnic. The general had his men start marching about 4 a.m. to beat the heat, hike till noon, and then knock off for the afternoon and evening. A French soldier wrote in his journal, "We were enchanted to find charming young ladies in our midst." Our general had the musicians play each evening, and we invited local girls to dance. The volunteers who take part in these reenactments have gone to quite a lot of trouble, as well as expense, to dress in the American uniforms and civilian clothing of that time, and they're impressive. But there seems to be something missing. Is this what the American troops really looked like then? The truth is, except for a comparative few, the rebel troops were often very poorly equipped. Farmers, backwoodsmen, militiamen from the frontier, poor folks generally, usually with little military training or uniforms, many wearing rags, some even forced to go without shoes. And nevertheless, those untidy characters, who didn't look much like the glamorized picture of a colonial soldier we see today, those rough militiamen won the war. What a reenactment it would be if they, in all their ragged glory, were also represented. It was early in July that Rochambeau completed his march through Connecticut and met Washington in the area of White Plains, New York. You could make the case, you'd get arguments, but you could make the case that what happened in this house and the adjacent area were how the United Colonies became the United States. Because this house in Hartsdale is where Rochambeau stayed for 6 weeks with Washington and his troops nearby. And it was in this area that the two men planned their strategy. With the help of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, they would go after the British General Cornwallis, who was pinned down on a peninsula in Virginia and who was ultimately forced to surrender. Few people at that battle, perhaps no one, realized that the American victory at Yorktown meant that for all intents and purposes the Revolutionary War was over. We had won. In 1824, huge crowds gathered at the national capital when the then President Monroe welcomed the Marquis de Lafayette, now an old man, who had been invited to visit America. He made a 13-month journey through the country. It was quite a day in the history of the town of Greenwich when Lafayette was met by a troop of Connecticut cavalry at the Byron Bridge in August of that year and was welcomed by a committee of Greenwich citizens. As a gesture of respect to the memory of his old comrade General Putnam, the Marquis de Lafayette, who could walk only with difficulty, insisted on leaving his carriage to walk down the hill of Putnam's famous ride from Greenwich to Stamford in 1779. The town of Greenwich will always remember Lafayette. And the state of Connecticut remembers Rochambeau and his march to victory.